Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Well, Fright Night is coming up. Yep, I'm talking about Halloween. It's just around the corner. And you may be seeing the signs of black magic around your neighborhood. Spooky ghosts and goblins, the dead rising from graves, creepy witches, and other evil incarnations. It's all scary stuff. But let's not forget that the practice of magic has also been for good. If you look back in time, and I'm talking hundreds of years, magic was used to try and solve all kinds of society's problems, whether it was catching a thief, helping you on a journey, or finding you a husband. And it was practiced by what Sharon Wright likes to call everyday magicians. Sharon Wright is a professor of late medieval history and the director of classical, medieval, and Renaissance studies at the University of Saskatchewan. And she joins us. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, Mary. So nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming on. I mean, of course, this is very timely with Halloween just days away. I was thinking about it, and we usually associate Halloween with evil, right? Bad witches, zombies, evil spirits coming to get us. Where does that come from? I'm wondering, is there actually historical basis for that concept that we have, or is this just another manufactured holiday?
Oh, no, it's an ancient holiday. When most of us, when we think about Halloween, we use the word Halloween. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon or Middle English word hallows, which means the saint. All Hallows is connected to a feast of misrule very early on. And the Feast of Misrule, as historians would think about it, it's a day when you're allowed to overturn all the rules of society and hierarchy. So, with Halloween, and being connected to the harvest, you have, people, mainly peasants, who are paying their tithes to landlords. And it's very expensive. It's a very heavy burden on little people to be paying these, wealthy landlords throughout, England and Europe. And so the idea of a Feast of Misrule, that you would have children going around door to door collecting food or goodies or treats from the people who you would normally be paying your food tithes to, makes complete sense when you think about Halloween being anchored in a feast of misrule, right? So, and the misrule, these ideas, these ancient ideas, are you have one day where all of these dark forces may be unleashed, or where peasants get to do whatever they want. And then the following day, when the saints arrive, when the Hallows are there, everything goes back to the way it was. So it's a kind of an opportunity to reinforce the fact that the world is actually under control and everything's as it should be. Kings rule, people and peasants work in the field, right? So it's an ancient feast.
What about this association as far as, resurrection and with the saints, and the whole idea of like saints and relics and the power of these relics of saints? Can you talk about that? Because I find that fascinating.
Sure. Well, that's why the saints protect you from the things that might be out there before Hallows Day. In the Christian world, there is the belief that in saints' bodies, something powerful inheres, something powerful is in them. And so medieval people and even early modern people collected body parts of the saints. There was actually a really rich stock in trade in parts of saints' bodies, fingers and heads and other body parts, and often collected from the catacombs in Rome. And they were used as a kind of a lucky charm. Now, the church would never have thought of them that way, but the people of Europe, the common folk, would. Right. So if you had a piece or even a piece of cloth that touched a saint's body, there was something about it that had a power in it that would protect you. So relics are still, in some cultures are still used, but there was a prominent trade in relics. And connected to the saints and the power of the saints. And sometimes they were richly encrusted in jewels with gems and pearls and put on display even into the Reformation period. So, if you were afraid of something, whatever the something was you were afraid of, you could go to the church and hang out with the saint for safety.
And what's the story with Joan of Arc? Because I guess there might have been a fear that she would be coveted as a saint?
Well, yes. I mean, so Joan of Arc was executed as a heretic. There's always a myth, since we're thinking of Halloween, about witches, that Joan of Arc was a witch, but she was actually prosecuted by the Burgundian church, right? French church, with the support of the English, as a heretic. And when she was eventually burned after a very long trial, in which she confessed to heretical practices and then said, no, I was actually forced to make this confession. The voices of angels that I heard, I actually heard them. So do with me what you will. When they burned her twice. And in order to prevent people from being able to collect the bones from the burning, and they raked the bones into a closer river to her execution site, so that no one could claim to have body parts of her that were efficacious, that they could venerate.
And what was the thinking behind burning? Why burning? Whether it was witches or criminals, what was behind that?
It was a fear. In the first place, it was the desire to destroy the body because of the belief that at the resurrection, our bodies would rise again and that we would be restored, right, at the end time. So it's part of the Christian narrative of eschatological narrative of the end times, right? So you have you need your body interred. And so criminals, for example, were not buried in sacred ground. They were buried outside of it. Or, heretics were never to be buried in hallowed ground or in sacred ground. So when you burned someone in that way, you destroyed their chances of going to heaven. So this is the idea behind burning a heretic and behind burning a witch.
Just thinking about Halloween again, if I had to choose one symbol, one iconic symbol of Halloween, for me, it would probably be the witch. Can you talk about some of the actual misconceptions we have about witches and, as far as historically, when they existed and how prevalent they were, that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, starting from thinking about Halloween, witches probably have attached themselves in the modern imagination to Halloween because of the 19th century and the Romantic period, which really got interested in witchcraft and really dramatized it. And honestly, I don't think there's, other than the Crusades, witchcraft is probably the worst understood in popular culture, historical events. So one of the major misconceptions about witchcraft is that the witch trials were happening in the medieval period, and they weren't. Witchcraft trials are part of the early modern world. So historians like this periodization, but when we think about the medieval world ending, especially in Northern Europe, we're talking around 1500, or maybe even the 1540s, the period of the Reformation. And then the early modern world coming after that, maybe before the Enlightenment. So the witchcraft trials are actually part of that early modern world. They're not really a part of the medieval world, although there are some roots there for sure. So that's one of the major misconceptions about witchcraft. Another is that witches are always women.
Mm-hmm.
So witches were, if we look at the numbers of witch trials, and historians have been very carefully studying witchcraft now for at least 50 years, since it's been, very carefully, records being gone through. And initially, and this is unfortunately what most people remember, there was this idea that millions of women were burned as witches. And that's really not true. There were probably maybe between 40 and 60,000 executions. That's a lot, but they're spread over a couple of 100 years, 250 years, and approximately a third of the people executed were men, maybe slightly smaller. So it could be like 70, 30, 75%, 25%, but there were quite a few men who were executed as witches. And in different places that demographic shifts. In Italy, more men were executed. In Russia, more men were executed. But in France and England and Germany, you find the balance maybe towards more women. So it's different in different places.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And what would contribute to all like these big misconceptions we have about witches and their place in history?
Oh, well, modern films, Game of Thrones. You name it. Any representation
Game of Thrones.
Honestly, any representation of women in the past doing something that's magical, there's always an assumption that they're a witch, right? And I think, as I often say to my students, we have this idea of history that kind of collapses. If you don't have a good sense of the long arc of history, the longue durée, we like to call it, you have a tendency to think about everything's back in the day. So women doing things that seemed kind of preternatural or supernatural, they had to be a witch. And this is, of course, made repeated over and over again in modern literature with a poor understanding of the length of history and the period in which witchcraft was actually happening.
Well, so it's interesting too, whenever, you say you hear about women and some sort of preternatural abilities, then they're automatically assumed to be a witch. Is it more than just that idea of collapsing history, but is it also sexism and how we view women?
Well, I suppose the short answer to that is yes. There for a very long time, there's been a strong binary belief about the way women and men are different. So you can look back to early Christian ideas about women as being the daughters of Eve, or like Pandora, the way in which evil comes into the world. And actually, if we think back to the time of the witch trials in the late 15th and 16th century, there was this very strong belief that women were more receptive to spiritual things. Like it was acceptable for women, for example, to be prophets. They could hear the voice of God, but that was a double-edged sword. You could also be the kind of woman who was more susceptible to the devil. So you might be more open to the spiritual world, but that could be more dangerous. That's maybe thinking of it in a more positive way. Many people thought of women as being less intellectually capable, less rational, and therefore more easily convinced to follow an evil path, if you will. So therefore more likely to fall into the devil's clutches, right? and therefore be a witch. So that kind of binary has traveled with us for a very long time. The idea that women are intellectually less capable, less rational beings just because of their bodies.
Yeah. And, I think that's why I find your work so interesting, because you've focused in the late medieval period on a group of people. They were known as magic practitioners. I hadn't even known about these people until I read your research. Can you talk a little bit about them? And then maybe we'd also like to bring up, that subset group of the cunning folk, but who were magic practitioners?
So magic practitioners are definitely different than witches and warlocks. Just to, these are actually real people who practiced what they would consider to be real magic. And one of the things about witches is that they were often accused falsely, and they were never actually magic practitioners. They just got caught up in this big conspiracy thing. But magic practitioners, who I study, I should say, by the way, with Frank Clausen, my colleague, they lived and they worked in the late medieval and the early modern period. And they're kind of like, we'll think of them as workaday magicians, right? There were many of them who were women. There were many of them who were men. They often had clients. There were quite a few of them who worked in late medieval and early modern towns throughout the medieval world. So as you said, some people think about them as cunning folk, but there's a kind of a hierarchy. So when I think about magic practitioners, you could be talking about some of the very elite or learned magic practitioners like John Dee, who was patronized by Queen Elizabeth I. And he was also one of the foremost mathematicians in England. He had a huge library. He was a cartographer, and he conjured angels. And he also thought that he was sort of at the center of a new world order. So he's a really interesting guy. But there have been quite a lot of people who've worked on him. But I'm interested in the lower level magic practitioners, the everyday ones, the ones who were there, who were going to try and help solve the problems that you couldn't solve by seeing a local apothecary, or if you couldn't solve a problem of a theft, or if you couldn't get pregnant. I wanted to know about those people, the little magic practitioners. And there are lots of them in Europe operating and not really seeming to fall afoul of the authorities. We usually find them in legal records, but it's for reasons other than they're practicing magic. It's that they got wound up in some other kind of legal case. And so we use the legal records to study their life and learn more about what they're doing. So
these lower level, or I guess in society, I guess they, as you say, they weren't the elite. These magic practitioners were called cunning folk, right?
Right.
I mean, yeah, and so and you're very interested, I know, in the women who were cunning folk. Can you talk about them?
I mean, men were cunning folk too. Just to be, and we're trying to sort of figure out what's the sex ratio between men and women. And it seems from our records, it's about half and half, maybe slightly more men, but that's still a lot of women. So the cunning folk were respected, and that's clear from the records that we look at. They performed magic for people to help them, not to harm them. So they weren't doing maleficium. They weren't doing bad things, which is maleficium is doing evil, is what it means in Latin. And you would go to cunning folk, a cunning woman. Maybe if you were a woman, it seems that women tended to go to cunning women for certain kinds of things. So some of the examples that I'm aware of, you have women would go to a cunning woman for help in getting pregnant if they had a lot of difficulty getting pregnant, right? Because having a child was a very important part of your status in the medieval world, especially if you were an elite woman, because having an heir was basically your job. So cunning women you might know about them by word of mouth, and that's how they seemed to have gotten most of their work, was their reputation. So they were reluctant to get involved with magical practices that might be considered a little more dangerous, like necromancy. I don't see cunning folk very often doing necromancy. But one of the other things about cunning women is they tend to be pretty local. Cunning men might travel a bit more, but cunning women seem not to move around as much. They seem to be more local in their villages.
How prevalent were they? Like, were they in every community in medieval, I guess, England at that time, and even Europe? Would you find them in almost everywhere?
Yes, I can't speak for Europe as much right now because I haven't been looking at the European records. But Owen Davies, who's done one of the largest studies of cunning folk, has been able to identify at least cunning people in almost every large village or little town. There was probably a cunning person that you could get to within a day's walk. So within a 20-mile radius, you were likely to be able to have a cunning person. And some of them specialized in certain kinds of cunning. So you might, know about one in one village and go and visit one in another. But certainly the records in Europe that our historians have worked on, Owen Davies included, it seems that there's probably at any one time thousands of them operating in England. And over a 200-year period, if we're studying them as I am with Frank Clausen, then, we could be looking at a very large number of people, particularly the women that interest me.
Yeah. And it just, the range of what they did, it seems so broad. You said, they could try and help you get pregnant, find a husband, catch a thief, help you on a journey. Like It's a combination of everything. Seems like a midwife and a sleuth and an apothecary and a doctor. What was in the toolbox of the cunning woman? What were they using for magic? So here's the thing that's interesting about them. So you've compared them and I mentioned earlier things like apothecaries and midwives, but they were definitely not doing the things that apothecaries and midwives were doing. And that's why they were filling a niche in society. So what you'd go to cunning folk for, or cunning women for, would be help with the things that were ordinary, but were hard to fix by other means. So finding out by divination or by scrying who stole your favorite set of beads. You might expect that it would be impossible to find that out, right? You might suspect your neighbors, but you would go to a cunning person and they would perform. So what would they have? I didn't have my stuff with me here in France, but I brought you something that you can see. So I'm holding up, this is actually a modern book and it's got a little lock on it like a medieval book would have. And they would take a key. So they would use this method of divination called a key and a psalter. And a psalter is a book of Psalms. So I'm opening the book here and I'm sticking the key in and locking the lock. And that would be the way that they would do this. Actually, the key would be more in the center of the book. Okay. And they would stick the key in at the Psalm, which talked about catching a thief. And then the magical operator and the person who wanted to know about the person who stole their, whatever it is they stole, would kind of do a little exercise. It was like the Ouija board. There'd be two hands here and they'd hold the key and the psalter in this way until it moved or fell. And that would indicate that the name of the thief that they suspected was actually the thief. And how they would know that is with the key. A medieval key would have a hole in the end, as I'm showing you here, and they would stick the paper with the suspect's name into the key, and then pop it into the psalter and do that little operation that I just showed you. So that's in their toolbox. That's the kind of thing that they would do. But their toolbox would also be an intellectual one. They would also do prayers. Oh, I see. I'm just wondering, though, my goodness, how many times would it be unfortunate that the person was wrongly, convicted, or the guilty person got away because that method wasn't, sure proof.
No. Well, so look at, I worked on cases where this happened. So looking at legal cases. So let's say I accuse you, Mary, and what's your recourse? And I now go around the village and say the magician has identified you. Your recourse would be you could go to the local authorities and say, probably to the local church actually, and say that you had been defamed. And you could bring a defamation suit against me and against the magician for claiming that you were a thief.
Right.
And you might win that case. You probably, in many cases, were won. So defamation was, dealing with the defamation suit would be one way of sorting that problem out. But in some cases, the accused thief would be very afraid and would somehow the stolen item would turn up again. And one of the reasons that cunning folk were so sought out for doing theft magic, it doesn't make sense to us in the modern world, but you think about how difficult it was to purchase things if you were poor. And so your important items, you would want them back. But if you accused someone of stealing something and it was proved that they did, and it was over 12 pence, they would be hung. 12 pence is not a lot of money, right? So you're maybe responsible for the death of your neighbor. So this was a kind of an extra legal way of putting pressure on someone who you thought and probably may have stolen your goods and getting them to return them in a way that protected their life and kept the harmony of the community in balance, right? It's hard to be responsible for killing someone and in that way, in a legal way, and especially if it's a suspicion. So magic alleviated stress in communities too. It was one of the reasons why people did it. So thief magic was one of the more popular ones, but love magic was too. And love magic was not just for procuring a marriage or for getting pregnant. It was also for making your social superiors like you. So you want a promotion, you go to the magician, you go to the cunning woman, you perform a ritual, and you get your promotion. Maybe.
Wow. And were they, do we know, were they well paid, these cunning people?
Yes, they were probably paid. Well, they were probably paid in small coin, or they were probably paid in kind. So in kind payment means, with food goods or with cloth or with books or with cash.
You also mentioned a term, something that they would do that I'm not familiar with, called scrying. What is scrying?
Oh, yes. Scrying is, and I can tell you a good story of a woman scryer that we've come across because women weren't often scryers. Scrying is when you conjure an angel or demon, but you want to control it. So you're going to keep it in a glass or a stone. Very frequently, they used something called a beryl stone, which is a really dark stone. But when you polish it, like when you look in your phone, but your phone's not on, you can see yourself in the reflection of it. So imagine that, right? What an example. But that's so you could scry in something that was polished. I know of one magic case where they used to polish a thumbnail and look and see in the polished thumbnail of the magician if the scryer could see what was going on. So a scryer is not the magician. A scryer is a person who is considered to be pure. So they often used young boys who were virgins. Occasionally they used girls who were virgins, and they would bring them into the magic ritual. They would conjure the demon by using often liturgical prayers. And then the child would look into the polished stone and would see something, would tell the adults what it was. And that would be used as something to predict the future, answer the question, or find the stolen good. So one of the cases that I've worked on was a woman named Nazareth Jarbury from the late 15th century in London in the parish of St. Mary Ab Church. And she is really interesting because she's a woman. She's a scryer. As I say, usually men are the ones, or boys that are doing scrying. And she worked with a cunning man whose name was Thomas Barley. And he's the magic operator. And she was there, and they were hired by a London cleric to try and find a box of stolen pearls. And when she looked into the barrel stone, she saw people who she could describe at length to this cleric. And he said, "Oh, I know who they are. I know who they are. So now I can go and find them and find those stones." So we know about this case because it ended up in the Bishop of London's courts. They were worried about what the cleric was doing, about the use of religious books in these magical ceremonies. So it's sort of verging on heresies. They weren't that worried about the magic. They were worried about heresy.
Okay, so you say that scryers they tried to conjure up demons and have them kind of encased in this stone. How is that different from necromancy?
Well, that is necromancy. That's what you're doing.
It is. Okay, it is. So that's what they were doing.
Right. So whenever you conjure a demon, you're practicing necromancy. And so necromantic magic has a lot more facets to it. But you're basically trying to conjure angels or demons. I mean, angel conjuring is people don't think of it necessarily as negatively as conjuring demons. Everybody who conjured a demon knew they were doing something they shouldn't be doing. And that's why they tried to hide it. That's why it was occult, right? It was hidden. Right. Whereas there's a kind of a fine line between being very devoted to your patron saint, your angel, and asking them to come and help you, or maybe having a relic of that saint's body. And there's that kind of fine line where you now sift over and you're making sigils. These are like a medallion that captures rays of the stars, and you've conjured it, a demon using it. Like, then you knew you were in really shady territory, but people did it. Our first book, The Magic of Rouges, talks about necromancers doing this sort of stuff.
But that's the thing. So I take it, my sense is that it wasn't that popular among cunning folk to practice necromancy. Is that right?
No, especially I know of no cases yet that I have found of women practicing necromancy. It seems that there is a gender division there, and I cannot yet explain it. It's probably to do with the fact that necromancy is connected more with learned magic, with book magic. And a lot of the cunning folk that I study, especially cunning women, although I do know cunning women who've used books, they don't seem to use books in their rituals. They know the prayers. They often use other things like girdles, and girdles are not the kind of thing we imagine they are now. They're actually not like, you imagine your grandma getting into her playtex girdle. No. Girdles they're kind of a belt that you wear, and they're often very expensive. So women from elite classes, they were coveted, and they were particularly the possession of women, but you could make wreaths or girdles and use them in magic. So women seem to use those kinds of things, and they might use Bibles too, but they don't seem to dabble very often in maybe what we might think is the darker side of conjuring.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating to know about this and these women and the cunning folk that existed back in the medieval period. And then, when I think about today, I mean, we still have them, don't we? And from what I understand, I mean, when you read, popular articles, there's been a resurgence of interest in witches and magics and spells. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that there have been a lot of people seeking a spiritual path that's separate from the traditional churches. And that's happened throughout history. There's always been new ways of forming a religion or a practice or a discipline. And so I think that, I don't think there's connection, and many people will argue with this, between modern witchcraft and ancient paganism. Certainly modern people can study the pagan past, but I don't think that there is a long tradition that winds through the Middle Ages and the early modern period to witches now, right? Witches now, Wiccans now, and people who practice witchcraft now, might know about past traditions from the pagan period, but they didn't survive through the Middle Ages. And I think that's been fairly well established by even pagan historians who are working on that, their own history. So what I think about it is that it's interesting, and I would be delighted to know if they were using medieval charms and they were working for them. I mean, one of the most important charms that cunning folk did in the Middle Ages was figuring out if you were enchanted and trying to remove the enchantment. So maybe that's why we need modern people practicing magic, is to help us with problems of enchantment and disenchantment.
Well, it makes me wonder too. I mean, if there is some kind of particular interest in magic today, I'm wondering if the pandemic has anything to do with it. Have there been times in history, troubled times perhaps, when there's been more of an interest and people relied more on magic? So, would it be something like a pandemic, or would it be something about the world situation the way we are today, or even especially here in North America?
I think that both the pagan community and practitioners, modern practitioners of witchcraft, have been around longer than this most recent pandemic. But what the most recent pandemic has done is it's really produced a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear about conspiracy. So we've seen things like QAnon, for example. And that happened in the medieval period as well. And it also happened again in the Iron Century, which is that early modern period that I was talking about earlier, which was incredibly violent. That's when Christendom was fracturing, and when there were these terrible wars of religion, and that's the period where people got kind of weirded out about witches. So I think that people are more interested in witches now, because there's more of a focus on conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not, as you say, it's not as if it's ever disappeared. We've always been drawn to magic, whether, in medieval times or earlier or now. Why do you think that is? Like, is there something innate in us that draws us to magic?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that, over the last couple of days, actually. Sometimes things that you can't explain, you can explain away by talking about magic, right? It's not, I also think a world that's disenchanted is a very boring world, right? The idea that something magical can happen to you is exciting, and in some ways kind of important, especially when you're at home in a lockdown and you're dreaming of like some magical good thing will happen to you. So, I was thinking about kindness as a kind of magic, right? And the more kindness you sort of put out into the world, sometimes the more kindness comes back to you, and that's it feels like a kind of a magic thing. But I think magic is, I think the attraction of magic is that we believe that we live in a disenchanted world now. And that actually, I'm not sure that that's true. I think that there are lots of things that happen that you can't always explain. And maybe that's the way our neurology works. Something spooky happens. You think, well, maybe that happened for a reason. Magic is interesting because we can't explain it. And because, sometimes we need an explanation for something that is bad, and sometimes we need it to be hopeful.
Wow, we could talk about so much more. We've just kind of drifted over the surface of this. It's fascinating stuff. Really enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Mary, thank you so much for asking me to do this. It was a lot of fun.
Sharon Wright is a professor of late medieval history, and she's the director of classical, medieval, and Renaissance studies at the University of Saskatchewan. For more information on Sharon's work, including books that she's co-authored with Frank Klassen about medieval magic, please check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. And our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. You might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram Podcast. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.